Welcome to the Prosper series, where we share the stories of remarkable veterans and military families who have prospered in their life after service. I'm your host, Talissa Papamount. In today's episode, we welcome our guest, Garth Callender. Garth, welcome to Prosper. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Talissa. Thanks for the invitation.
Lieutenant Colonel Garth Callender has held regimental, staff on divisional headquarters and training command positions and was awarded an Army Bronze Level Commendation for his planning for large-scale MRE for Iraq and Afghanistan deployments. He has deployed to Iraq in 2004 as troop leader and 2006 as executive officer. In recognition of his efforts, in 2006 he received a Deputy Chief of Joint Operations Commendation. Garth was the first seriously wounded Australian casualty of the war in Iraq, after his armoured vehicle was targeted by an insurgent bomb attack. Garth rehabilitated from injury and eventually deployed to Iraq again and Afghanistan. During his deployment to Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010, he commanded the ADF Weapons Intelligence Team in Uruzgan Province, receiving a Commander JTF 633 commendation for his work. Since leaving full-time military, Garth has held a number of high-profile roles, including the first New South Wales Government Veterans Employment Program. He has been appointed the board of the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust and more recently appointed chair of Bravery Trust. Currently, he is managing director of Trebuchet Pivot, a consulting practice specialising in risk advisory and crisis management. Garth is also a published author of his books After the Blast and Best Possible Outcome. Now, it's an impressive bio. It's hard to fit it into a single introduction. So I'm really keen to unpack all of it in more detail with you this morning. But let's start at the beginning. Yep. And what led you to join the military?
It's a funny time to be asking that question, because I guess I've been in for far too close to 30 years right now, and I've known a lot of people whose children are now joining the military. And so we're sort of talking about that a lot, what led me to join the military, but also what children getting interested in the military, and what's the driving thing behind that. Look, and to be honest, for me, it was, and shouldn't probably tell this too much, but I had, like probably a lot of us in the military, if not all of us in the military, got a real service nature, and I'd gone through high school thinking that I'd join the police. But I had bought a motorbike and racked up a whole lot of speeding tickets, and couldn't get into the police at that stage. And at the time, Defence had the Ready Reserve scheme going, and so I could sign up for 12 months, and that really appealed to me. So it's not the most patriotic answer or anything like that. It was because I was a somewhat directionless 18-year-old. But the military very much appealed to that service nature.
No, that's fantastic. I appreciate the honesty and the authenticity, and I it's definitely one of my more favourite memorable responses. So, since you joined, and you can talk us through some of your military career and any of the highlights, any of the sort of take-home parts that you carry forward with you today would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. So, look, I joined the military in the mid-90s, and there wasn't actually much going on in regards to deployments. So, whilst I wouldn't say that the first few years of my defence service was slow or boring, in fact, it was probably quite the opposite. Had some amazing experiences, not the least being that first 12 months, I deployed to Rifle Company Butterworth for 3 months, which was a incredible eye-opening experience. So yeah, those first 12 months was ended up being posted to the 6th Battalion in Brisbane. I chopped and changed between full-time and part-time service, and during a part-time service got suggested that I apply for Duntroon, so I did that and went through officer training. Eventually came out the back end of that and went to Armoured Corps. I deployed a couple of times with the cavalry regiment, particularly 2 Cav and 2nd 14th Light Horse, as part of the Australian Security Detachment in Baghdad. I was pretty badly injured on my first trip over there from a roadside bomb, so I got really interested in improvised explosive devices and technical intelligence, which led to my third deployment, which was running a weapons intelligence team in Afghanistan. But look, so much of my career has been focused around training, and I, not by design, rather just by chance, and probably I really enjoy that, so it's probably shaped me a bit. But everything from being staff at Recruit Training Battalion at Kapuka through to training, you're being pulled out and plugged in as staff assisting the training for deployments to Iraq, and then later running the mission rehearsal exercises for Op Slipper and Catalyst, so Iraq and Afghanistan. And then even after leaving the full-time service, I've really been drawn to that space. So I've worked at the Queensland University Regiment, instructing on captains and majors courses, was commanding officer of the University of New South Wales Regiment, which is a training regiment, and then now I'm directing staff at the War College for Command and Staff College Remote Course. So those emerging senior leaders in defence.
So would you say that you would have a passion for training, or do you think that it's something that you've just become naturally good at because of experiences and different things as you've sort of grown and developed as a person through your ADF career?
Look, I think it's a combination of the two. I do have a passion for it, and I can bring my experiences to that environment, and one of my happy places these days is I run an ethics week for the staff college course, and it's incredible to have the opportunity to work with academics, but more so the 80 or so course members as they pull apart really interesting issues around current ethical and cultural issues facing the Defence Force.
It's fantastic. So you did touch on it a little bit earlier around, and I'm aware that you were one of Australia's first seriously wounded in the Iraq War. Do you mind talking a little bit about that incident and any of the take-home messages, I guess, that have made you a better version of yourself today? Yeah, and
I do love that term, a better version of yourself. It's a really nice term. So look, the background to it was my first deployment, nearly 2 months into it. So 25th of October 2004, my patrol was targeted by a roadside bomb, and I was quite badly injured. There is heaps of bad stuff that goes along with explosions in war zones, and there were I wear physical scars. Some of the boys over there wear emotional scars. But I would like to think there's a lot of good stuff, or there is some good stuff that can be pulled out of it. I've learnt and grown a lot from that incident. Aspects around understanding risk and the impact of real risk. Not that as a lieutenant, I know a lot of my peers saw real risk being yelled at by their commanding officer, or getting marked down in their annual report and sent to a less than high profile posting, whatever it might be. But I understood really early in my career that risk involved humans, and often involved flesh and blood, and it really drove me. And again, probably link back to your question earlier around training. It really focused me on training, making sure that people get it right when they train, and they're best prepared to mitigate risks around things like bombs, but also so they're best prepared to manage incidents when they do occur.
No, it's something obviously from my previous life that I'm being a medic. It's something that I'm very, very passionate about, because for us it is training is flesh and blood, as you've mentioned. It's human life that you're dealing with, and certainly in the military environment, which is of course translatable to so much of the work you're doing now. It's ensuring the best outcome, and really, I think that we owe it to Australia's men and women to provide the best care we possibly can. So,
absolutely,
you have gone full time, and now you're reserve, or have you left full time service? And if so, I was wondering what led to your transition.
Yeah. Look, I like to think of myself as a military professional who just happens to be part-time these days. So, there's Defence has a total workforce system in place. I embody that. So, yes, I if you really want to run through my career, I did 12 months full-time initially, then did 18 months part-time, did another 15 or so years full-time, and now I'm part-time. I don't tend to use the word reserve these days because most of the jobs that I do, I'm not backing anyone up. If I'm not there, that job doesn't get done, so there's nothing reserve about it. Yeah. So it was really simple for me. I've got married. I've got 3 daughters. When I left, my eldest was 5 years old. I had been away. So she was 5. I'd been away for 2 years of her life. I'd moved her home 5 times. And I think at the time, that early to mid 30s is getting sort of pretty close to the bell curve for when a lot of people step out of defence, because you have those other pressures and your priorities shift. And I definitely did. So I had some pressure to go back to Afghanistan, and I sat down with my wife Crystal, and we discussed it, and we thought it's probably the best time for me to think about what my next career would be. So yeah, it was really family impacts which forced me. Not forced me. That's the wrong term. Which really led me to transition out of time service.
As part of that transition, you what are you doing with yourself these days?
So look, my professional life is somewhat complex. It gets described back to me that I have a portfolio career, which is a fancy way of saying I do a few different things. So if we want to think, I kind of think of it as pillars. I've got 3 pillars in my professional life. One is military service. The other is work as a non-executive director. So particularly these days, it's as the chair of Bravery Trust. And that's also that great link into what I do, feeding back into the veteran community. And then the third is I run my own business, a niche consulting firm around risk advisory and the spicier end of risk. So crisis management, and it's assisting leadership teams, particularly executive teams and boards, on how to make decisions to best protect their organisation during uncertainty.
And that would be the Trebuchet Pivot. Did I say that right?
Yeah, that's Trebuchet Pivot. Yeah.
That is quite a name. I thought it's unusual. And so, and what brought the name on? Was there thinking behind that?
Yeah, there is. I guess at the really superficial level, I like. So Trebuchet is kind of like an old medieval catapult, and I kind of like the metaphor between that transfer of forces to create an upward trajectory type thing. But really, more so, it comes from the time I spent in Afghanistan, and the insurgent commanders, so Taliban commanders, rather than using their names, they were given objective names, they called them, and they used medieval weapons. So you'd have objective pike or objective sword or objective dagger, and there was an objective trebuchet, and he was a really sneaky guy. he worked out to the east of our base in Tarankout, and from my work in technical intelligence, I learned so much about this guy. He used anti-handling switches for his IEDs, so specifically targeting people trying to disarm them. I know he had full brothers. I'd been to places where he stayed. I'd seen indents in the corn crops of where him and his brothers had laid waiting for people. So I felt this real personal connection with, almost as a nemesis type thing, which sounds a bit flaky, but I did know so much about this guy. So when I was starting my business, I thought, it'd be good to incorporate Trebuchet into it somehow.
No, when I read it, I'll be honest, I had to Google it. So I'd gotten as far as knowing it was a medieval catapult. But I thought it was like, no, there's got to be a story behind that. And so I definitely wanted to find out the story behind the name. So I also want to talk, of course, to your involvement with Bravery Trust. So you were appointed the chair a few years ago. Tell us about Bravery Trust.
Yeah, it's a fantastic organisation. In fact, it's just ticked over being 10 years old now, and we support about 600 or 700 veterans and their families annually. We know from the latest census data that there's 580,000 veterans in the country, and we're not there to support all veterans. Rather, we're there to support those who are in financial hardship and financial crisis. When I came on board, and the organisation was started through a number of trustees to support veterans and their families who were going through a really tough time. I'm delighted in the last few years we've really got into the preventative space as well. So rather than just providing funds for rent to keep roofs over heads, paying grocery bills, paying for petrol and car repairs, things like that. We're now working in the preventative space. So financial counselling to assist people manage their debt often and get them back onto an upward trajectory. One, so hopefully they don't fall into crisis in the first place, or secondly, so if they do find themselves in crisis, it's not a recurring issue. And then there's a lot of financial education that we're getting into as well. So financial fitness, making sure that those stepping out of defence or who have recently stepped out of defence have a good understanding about how to manage their finances going forward. So we're quite narrow in what we do. It's very much focused on finances. And as part of that, it means that we are very big on collaboration because, like I said, we don't offer all things to all veterans. So we have an aspect of what we do is triage and connection and networking of veterans who need support services with those services that are out there. So look, it's incredibly rewarding work, and it kind of goes back to that incident in Baghdad in 2004. 25 Australian soldiers that in one way or another helped save my life, and it's such a rewarding work to be able to feed back into the veteran community with the work we're doing with Bravery Trust.
I couldn't think of anybody better placed to be involved in the work. Obviously, this project is with CSC or the Vets Hub, who have a clear focus on financial wellbeing and sort of financial literacy, which I think really goes hand in hand with the work with Bravery Trust. So I'd love to talk more about it. It's something, I guess once I sort of left the military, I was very much in the mental health space. And as time's sort of progressed, and I'm now very, very passionate about financial wellbeing and financial literacy. And to me, it's a core mechanism around ensuring a successful transition experience. And that's regardless for me on if it's a voluntary, medical or administrative separation or transition. I think there's there's such a need, and it's sort of a real missing piece at the moment. And I'd love to see financial literacy for veterans, regardless of rank, improve. So from your experiences with the Bravery Trust and around financial hardship of veterans, what are some of the key factors from what you've observed so far that sort of get veterans in a situation where they're experiencing financial hardship?
So we capture a lot of data in regard to the work that we do and our beneficiaries. And we do that so we can understand the broader story of what's happening in the veteran space. And that's helpful for us to be able to make sure that our services meet the needs that are out there, but also to be able to inform the government, to be able to inform other ex-service organisations and government support or whoever it might be supporting veterans. So one of the things which really hit me was looking at this data and seeing that so many veterans, when they come to us, it's 5 to 10 years post their separation, and during that time they've been on this downward spiral. And let's be honest, Bravery Trust often the people we see and approach us or their family approaches us are in pretty bad shape. And so often it's been a downward trajectory for quite some time before they sort of hit this rock bottom point, and can't pay rent, can't support their family. So to me that was really confronting, that people were having such a hard time for so long before they got themselves in a position where they or someone close to them reached out for support on their behalf.
I'm surprised in that data myself. That sort of 5 to 10 years post separation, I would have thought it's earlier, but perhaps some of the assistance and financial support that some veterans receive upon leaving defence might insulate that. But that's, I guess, assuming you're talking only medical transitions.
Yeah. And as we know, there's people that transition voluntarily out of defence who are not necessarily in a good state. And let's be honest, don't necessarily disclose that when they leave. So that can be part of it. But definitely, that 20 or so % who do medically discharge are statistically far more likely to approach Bravery Trust later. So, leaving the services not on their own choosing definitely leaves them more likely to find themselves in hardship later.
And I think so at least from the observations I've had, this financial advice, financial education piece around, even as much as obviously there's just the generic financial literacy sort of principles, but specific and tailored information around things like people's incapacity payments, things like the invalidity pensions, and very much how they interrelate between government agencies is one thing. But it's an interesting topic that's been thrown around at the moment, and I'm interested in your views around, we've got some veterans that have maybe known or accepted mental health, accepted substance issues, and then we give them in excess of $400,000. Now that is unique to the veteran cohort. Our civilian counterparts, particularly civilian counterparts who perhaps have those sorts of issues, aren't given a compensation payout in that same capacity. And I'm wondering if you think there's any utility or benefit around financial advice and financial education around how best to use those sorts of opportunities to sort of insulate people years down the track.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. It's a tricky one because we also don't want to create a nanny state where we're looking like we're holding onto funds for people and we don't trust them. But we have seen so many examples of people who particularly have substance abuse issues or are not in a good mental state, or what is more often the case is the combination of a series of issues they have, who are given lump sum payments which disappear extremely quickly and are not used for the purpose that they're intended. That is heartbreaking. Look, let's be frank as well. We're in the middle of a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. It doesn't leave people in a good state when they've come out, had a lump sum payment, and then that money disappears. So yeah, look, it is an absolute issue. I know from discussions with government in particular, at DVA, there is a focus on that and how that's best managed, because right now it's not the most optimum situation. Interesting. This last week I was having a chat with one of your colleagues at Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation, and they spoke about a similar thing, which is superannuation payouts and people taking lump sums then, and often there's a similar outcome. There's buy a new four-wheel drive, buy a new boat, all these sorts of things, and within a short period of time that money is used, and the reason for it being there in the first place hasn't been achieved. But yeah, it's absolutely an issue.
Yeah. And it's I think speaking from my time in defence, you saw so often veterans they would do their deployments and they'd have a sexy car afterwards, and I think that the awareness around financial well-being, financial literacy, can start in service. Really we get quite good paying conditions, and I'd love to see us use those in a way that really set people up regardless of what happens in their career.
Yeah, and look, I couldn't agree more. I guess there's two key factors that I think are hampering us. One is pride. So often people don't reach out for help or assistance. Military is very good at building pride in people, but it can be detrimental sometimes, particularly if individuals are struggling to work out their finances, or even were struggling to deal with financial hardship. And secondly, it's in line with what you talk about in regards to financial education. The military does not teach financial risk, particularly not personal financial risk. It doesn't matter if you do a good job or a bad job, you'll get paid every second Thursday. And the Australian Defence Forces are one of the best paid in the world. So very rarely would anyone, it's not true, but it's not particularly common that the people in defence find themselves in significant financial hardship.
And the other sort of area that I'm interested in, and I know it's an area that you've done fantastic work, was the New South Wales Government Veterans Employment Program. I think that was one of the times I saw you, but I mean, this really does, again, relate, or it is one of the components of financial wellbeing and financial literacy for veterans. So talk us through a bit of that program, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So it started in early 2016. So my involvement came about because I'd just written a book at the time, and I had you do the cheesy sort of book tour, and bit of a speaking circuit thing. I was talking to a bit of media, and they'd often ask, what's one of the biggest issues facing the veteran community, and expecting me to say post-traumatic stress or this or whatever. And at the time, I'd seen a lot of really high caliber people leave defence and not be able to find reasonable employment. And so I spoke about that, and unbeknown to me, the New South Wales government at the time had been listening to other veterans talk about exactly that, and so they had made an election promise to employ it was employing 200 veterans within that their next term in office, so within 3 years, and so I got a call from the ministers for Veterans Affairs in New South Wales government, from his chief of staff, and he said, "You're making a lot of noise about this. Put your money where your mouth is and apply for this job," which I did, and I got it. And it was a fantastic opportunity just to be able to break down some of those barriers on both sides. So getting employers in state government to understand what veterans bring from their military service, but also getting veterans to understand how employable they are, and get over some of those traditional hurdles of being able to understand how relevant their skills are, but also how to ensure the transferability and understanding of those skills in potential employers. So it was again fantastic, rewarding work.
Yeah, very foundational, and to me, I think it certainly informed a bit of a framework of how and then sort of mapped across military experience to the sort of government and civilian sectors. It's probably not a challenge that we predicted, but it's probably a bit of a byproduct of the professionalisation of the Defence Force. I often contemplate things about, what makes a contemporary veteran unique. And, I guess our last comparable may have been the Vietnam veteran cohort, who, often had jobs in civilian life, went and served in the military, and then have gone back to those civilian jobs. But since that time, Australia's professionalised as a defence force, and this piece that you did with the New South Wales Government Veterans Employment Program is definitely, I think, a critical foundational part of then what it means to be a professional defence force.
Yeah. Just at the time I did some research, and there's so many parallels, even going back, you mentioned Vietnam cohort, but going back to World War One, there's a fantastic story about a chap, William Stansfield. I'm pretty sure his name is. He'd been a lieutenant colonel in the army. He'd been deputy director of logistics under Harry Chauvel for the Desert Corps, and so running logistics for what, I can't remember the exact number, but tens of thousands of men and horses. He was the key guy. They kept them fed and watered, so they could have all the victories that they had throughout the Middle East during World War One. And this chap came back to Australia and went back into the exact same low-level job that he left 4 years beforehand. And it was only when Harry Chauvel was in Queensland, he came back and was the equivalent of the Chief Defence Force, and he was travelling through Queensland and tracked this guy down and found him in a job at that level, and went and spoke to the director of I'm sure it was Queensland Rail at the time, and said, "Do you know the calibre of the chap you've got working for you?" And this guy was instantly promoted and put into a job which was more in line with his skills and experience that he developed during his time in defence. And that's over 100 years ago.
Right. Oh, well, it's something then that is sort of, I guess, gone along the history one way or another. But I do believe that military service is something that can enhance people's skills and utility in the workplace, sort of regardless of what they go on and then do. To this end, just around the transition now, you've transitioned at least to part-time, and we've touched on financial well-being, we've touched on employability. Is there any other advice or or take-home messages that you think are relevant to people who are much earlier in their transition?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this before we had the discussion. I've written down a few notes. I've underlined a couple of things here, which I think are important. But I think we met during that SBS Insight program where they were talking about transition defence members. And I don't know if you recall, but there were two guys in the audience, or maybe the panel discussion, two individuals who transitioned well. They'd had a relatively good experience. And I often reflect on what it was about those two. And that the key parallel, the key link between those two is they had left with a plan, which again is not necessarily as easy to do for those medically discharged. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that. And to be honest, when I left the full-time Defence Force, I didn't have a decent plan. So learn from what I did wrong just as much as anything else. But these two chaps had a plan. They both used some of the resources that were available in defence. So some of the things that they could get to upskill. So into the areas where they wanted to work. So understand what their skills were, and then understand what the gaps are, and use, defence does have a reasonable amount of programs to get people upskilled. But you need to understand where you want to be at the end of it all. So defence I think defence people are fantastic at project management. So understanding what the end state is, but understanding all those things they need to do to get there. So they need to use that skill. And I would say don't rush it either. Have a pragmatic approach. Again, for those medically discharged, it's not quite as simple, but again, defence is now different to what it was a few years ago. But people aren't rushed out necessarily when they get a medical determination that they will be medically transitioned out. So I would say don't rush it. Use the skills that are available. And then I already talked a bit about understanding what skills you have and the relevance and how transferable they are and where the gaps might be. But the last thing, and I think probably one of the most important things we should do, is network. When I was running the Veteran Employment Program, I'd often speak to groups of veterans, and I'd say to them, "Hey, stick your hands up who got a job through an online advertisement, seek.com or any of those." Very rarely would I have a single hand up. So, right, who got a job from someone in their network? And most people would have their hand up. So use those networks you have available to them. Search for people with defence backgrounds in an industry that you're interested in working in, and reach out to them, even if you don't know them. I don't know of anyone really who's ever been turned down when somebody's reached out and said, "Hey, do you mind if we catch up for coffee? I'd love to understand what you do in your industry and how I can get into it," and things like that. So, my firm belief is defence, 580,000 of us veterans across the country, we should have the strongest old school tie network of any organisation in the country, of any alumni in the country. We're not there, but I think a key to that is professional networking, knowing how to do it, and using those people with military backgrounds who are throughout all areas of business and government. So they'd sort of be my key bits of advice for people leaving defence.
No, that's fantastic. And the networking one is something that, I certainly wish someone told me earlier in the piece.
Yep.
And I think that can't be understated. And I love the idea. I'd love to think that as a community we could build an alumni and support those
Absolutely.
who are going through the journey just a few steps behind ourselves.
Absolutely.
Lastly, I'd love to talk a little bit about the books, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I've published 2 books. So After the Blast, published in 2015, which was very much autobiographical. Sort of spoke about my 3 deployments, all of which were spicy in one way or another. And then from when I started Trebuchet Pivot, I've done so much work with boards and executive teams, and often I'll use military anecdotes to reinforce lessons, which are just as relevant for business teams as they are for military teams. But it's the fundamentals of leadership, particularly leadership when things are tough. So around having the right mindset, around having the right culture, and having the right team around you, but also having a process to step through when things are difficult. So understanding your situation, being able to scenario plan, to understand what you might be facing. So be able to contextualize, but also conceptualize what issue it is and how it's going to affect your organisation, and then come up with a plan for solving a problem or stepping through a process which will get you one step closer to solving the problem. So that I'd been doing that for a couple of years, and then COVID hit, and a strange thing happened for those who are in crisis management, which is people didn't reach out to us, which was really odd. And it was pretty common across a lot of organisations who worked in crisis management. Is organisations were in crisis across pretty much every industry, and people were. It comes back to kind of that Far Side comic with the cavemen pushing a cart up the hill with a square wheel, saying, "No, we don't have time for that round wheel." Really felt like that. So I had a bit of time on my hands, so I put all those anecdotes and lessons down on paper and turned that into my second book, which is called Best Possible Outcome, which is really around those 3 things: how to have the right mindset to run a team during uncertainty, how to build a culture and a team to help you manage uncertainty, and then how to have a process to work through that problem. Because again, history would tell us that the crises don't occur at 10 o'clock on Monday morning when everyone's fresh. They happen at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend. And so it's good to have a process which you go back to. It really came about from being a squadron commander and also working at the Combat Training Centre and seeing, at the Combat Training Centre was a fantastic opportunity to see combat team headquarters and battle group headquarters and how they would react. And the ones that were performed really well were the ones that had a process. So I took something away from that, used it and refined it myself when I was a squadron commander, and then used a similar process for corporate teams.
Yeah, so the pandemic was that much of a crisis that no one saw it coming. I don't think anyone had ever thought that a pandemic would shut the entire world down. And I think now it's something that most people have built one way or another into some contingency plans.
Yeah, and it was, there were some really interesting things that came out of it. That if you go to most businesses and you go and you look at their risk register and what they had in place, quite often a lot of businesses had all the things that occurred, impact on their workforce, health and safety issue from some sort of disease, supply chain issues, compliance with changing government legislation, things like that. They would have had all those things listed, but never did they expect them to occur all at once and overlap and impact their organisation in ways which they hadn't anticipated. So that's, crisis management isn't following a flow chart of if this happens, do this. Rather, it's understanding how to understand your environment and how it's being impacted upon, but then also being able to make decisions to deal with that for something you hadn't anticipated previously. So that's I've got copies of these everywhere. But yeah, that's what that's all about. And so that's been really good and quite an interesting little journey, getting that one out there. So yeah, like I said, it's just particularly the first two sections of that are sort of full of military stories, which again, hopefully, highly transferable for corporate teams.
No, that's fantastic. When we release our chat today, we'll be sure to include the links on where people can purchase best possible outcome, and as well as after the blast. Garth, I was really excited to have a chat to you today for many, many reasons. Just sort of in wrapping up, is there anything else you'd like to say in summary?
Oh, look, it's great talking to you, Talissa, and just delighted there's people like you out there sort of flying the flag. I love seeing people achieving great things for the veteran community post their service. So I spoke about it right at the start, that service nature and that altruistic, selfless part of people's character, which so often drives them to military service, and people like you carry on with post their service. So thanks for everything you're doing with this and the work you're doing with CSC.
Thank you, Garth. And likewise, tremendous respect for you and your story. Veterans have a hell of a lot to offer. That they not, I think serving your country is just the beginning for what so many of us can go on and do. And you're certainly a wonderful example of that. Thank you, Garth, for sharing your story, and thank you to all our listeners. We hope you got some valuable insights from this discussion today. You can listen to more such veteran transition stories. Keep an eye out on our social media channels or visit our website for future updates.